The crowd gathered at York Saloon had never witnessed anything like it. Josephine Hayes stood trembling on the makeshift platform, her chestnut hair falling in loose waves around her shoulders as the afternoon sun slanted through the dusty windows. The year was 1879, and desperation had driven her to the unthinkable. Her voice cracked as she addressed the room full of rough-hewn miners, cowboys, and drifters. "1 year of my service to the highest bidder," she announced, chin held high despite the fear in her eyes. "Cooking, cleaning, whatever honest work is required." The murmurs that rippled through the crowd made her stomach clench. Some men understood exactly what she was offering, and their leering glances made her skin crawl. But she thought of her 3 younger sisters back at their dilapidated cabin, belly empty and shivering under threadbare blankets, and steeled her resolve. "Bidding starts at $50, called out the barkeep, a sympathetic man who'd agreed to conduct this unusual auction after finding Josephine sobbing behind his establishment earlier that day. The shouting began immediately, figures rising rapidly as men waved dollar bills and made crude suggestions. Josephine fixed her gaze on the back wall, refusing to look at the faces of the men who sought to own her. "200, called a gruff voice from the back, silencing the room. The crowd parted, revealing a tall figure still shrouded in the shadows of the doorway. Boots thudded heavily against wooden planks as he approached, spurs jingling with each step. When he emerged into the light, Josephine saw a man perhaps 30 years of age, broad-shouldered and weather-beaten. His dark hair was flecked with trail dust, and his piercing blue eyes were fixed solely on her. "200 and my entire ranch," he said, voice cutting through the silence. A collective gasp rippled through the saloon. Everyone in York knew the Yancey Ranch, 5,000 acres of prime grazing land, a substantial herd of cattle and one of the finest homesteads in the territory. The barkeeper's eyes widened. "York Xerxes, are you drunk, man?" The cowboy didn't flinch. "Sober as a judge." "The girl and her sisters come to live at my ranch. They'll have a home, food, protection. No other services required." His eyes never left Josephine's. "They all come home with me." Josephine's heart hammered against her ribs. She'd heard of York Xerxes, a man who kept to himself, worked harder than any 3 men combined, and was rumored to have traveled west with a past he never spoke of. Women in town speculated about him, but none had managed to capture his interest. "Why?" she whispered, the single word barely audible. His expression remained unreadable. "Because no woman should have to sell herself to feed her family. Not in my town." Tears pricked at Josephine's eyes. For 3 months since her parents' death from fever, she'd struggled to keep her sisters fed. At 22, she'd exhausted every respectable option before arriving at this desperate measure. "Going once," called the barkeeper, looking around the silent room. "Going twice. Sold to York Xerxes." The crowd erupted in murmurs as York approached the platform and offered his hand to help Josephine down. His palm was calloused but warm, and she noticed a long scar running from his wrist to his knuckles. "My wagon's outside," he said quietly. "We'll collect your sisters and whatever belongings you have." "Mr. Xerxes," Josephine began, finding her voice. "I appreciate your generosity, but I can't accept your ranch. Perhaps we could negotiate fair wages, for it's not charity," he interrupted, his voice firm but not unkind. "I need help running the place. Been meaning to hire someone anyway." He paused, watching her face. "And it's York. Just York." Outside, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the dusty Main Street. York's wagon was well maintained, hitched to 2 strong chestnut horses that stomped impatiently. As he helped her climb onto the wooden seat, Josephine felt the weight of dozens of eyes watching from the saloon windows. "Where do your sisters wait?" York asked, taking up the reins. "Our cabin's about 2 miles east of town," she replied, "just beyond the creek bend." York nodded and clicked his tongue, setting the horses in motion. They rode in silence for several minutes, the only sounds the creaking of the wagon wheels and the rhythmic clop of hooves. "Thank you," Josephine finally said, her voice barely audible above the wagon's rumble. "But I need to understand, why would you offer your entire ranch? It makes no sense." York kept his eyes on the road ahead. "My pa used to say that a man's worth isn't measured by what he owns, but by what he's willing to give up for what's right." He paused. "I've got land and cattle. You've got sisters who need food and shelter. Seems like a fair trade to me." "But, Miss Hayes," he said, finally turning to meet her gaze, "I've been alone on that ranch for 5 years now. It's too big for one man, too quiet." His eyes returned to the road. Maybe it's time it had some life in it again. Josephine studied his profile, the strong jawline, the slight furrow between his brows, the way he squinted slightly against the setting sun. She couldn't decide if he was the most noble man she'd ever met, or if there was something more to his unexpected generosity. The wagon turned down a narrow dirt path, and soon the Hayes cabin came into view. It was a small, dilapidated structure with a sagging roof and gaps in the walls where chinking had fallen away. A thin wisp of smoke rose from the chimney, suggesting that at least one of her sisters had managed to keep the fire going. Before the wagon had fully stopped, the door burst open and 3 girls rushed out. The oldest, Jane, was 17 with the same chestnut hair as Josephine. The middle sister, Julia, was 14 and already showing signs of their mother's delicate beauty. The youngest, Jennifer, was barely 9 with wide eyes and a sprinkle of freckles across her nose. "Joey," Jennifer cried out, using the pet name only family was allowed. "We thought you'd never come back." Josephine jumped from the wagon and gathered her sisters into her arms, holding them tight as if afraid they might disappear. Over their heads, she met York's gaze as he remained seated in the wagon, giving them privacy for their reunion. "Girls," she said, her voice steady despite her churning emotions, "this is Mr. York Xerxes. He's offered us a place to stay at his ranch." 3 pairs of eyes turned to assess the stranger. Jane, always the most protective and suspicious, frowned. "What's the catch?" York climbed down from the wagon and approached slowly, as if careful not to frighten them. "No catch, miss. Your sister agreed to help run the place. You'll all have rooms of your own, plenty to eat, and I'll see that you get proper schooling." Julia's eyes widened. "Our own rooms? Really?" "Really," York confirmed with a slight smile, the first Josephine had seen from him. Jennifer looked up at her oldest sister. "Joey, does this mean we don't have to be hungry anymore?" The innocent question broke Josephine's heart. She swallowed hard and nodded. "That's right, Jen. No more empty bellies. Pack whatever you want to bring," York instructed. "We should reach the ranch before full dark if we leave soon." The girls rushed inside to gather their meager possessions. Josephine lingered, watching York as he walked around the small clearing, examining the crude vegetable garden she'd struggled to maintain. "You've done well," he said, nodding toward the rows of carrots and potatoes. "Not many people could keep a garden going, and 3 sisters fed on their own." "Not well enough," Josephine replied bitterly. "Or I wouldn't have been standing on that auction block today." York's expression darkened. "Don't think on that anymore. What matters is what comes next." Within half an hour, the sisters had packed their belongings: clothes, a family Bible, their mother's hand mirror, and a few other precious keepsakes. York helped load everything into the wagon, then assisted each girl onto the seat. There wasn't quite enough room, so Josephine found herself perched at the edge, one of York's strong arms extended behind her back to ensure she didn't fall as they traveled. As they pulled away from the only home the girls had ever known, Josephine felt a curious mixture of grief and relief wash over her. She glanced back once, memorizing the silhouette of the cabin against the darkening sky, then faced forward, toward whatever uncertain future awaited them all at the Xerxes ranch. The wagon rolled steadily northward as the first stars appeared in the evening sky. Jennifer fell asleep against Jane's shoulder, while Julia peppered York with questions about the ranch, how many cattle, whether there were horses they might ride, if there was a proper kitchen with a real stove. York answered patiently, his deep voice rumbling in the gathering darkness. About 500 head of cattle, 6 horses including these 2, and yes, there's a proper kitchen. My mother insisted on it when they built the place. Your mother, Josephine said softly, is she? Gone, York replied, the single word heavy with unspoken grief. Both my parents passed in '74, influenza. Josephine nodded silently. Death was a familiar companion in these harsh territories. I'm sorry. The road began to climb a gentle slope, and as they crested the hill, the Xerxes ranch spread out before them in the fading light. A substantial 2-story house stood proudly against the backdrop of rolling grasslands. A large barn, corrals, and several outbuildings completed the scene. Warm light glowed from a few windows, suggesting someone was already there. It's beautiful, Julia breathed. York's expression softened as he gazed at his home. My father built it with his own hands. Took him 3 years. He clicked to the horses, urging them down the slope toward the ranch house. Mrs. Wilkins comes in 3 days a week to cook and clean. I sent word with a ranch hand when I left town, so she should have supper waiting. As they drew closer, Josephine could see that the house was even more impressive than it had appeared from a distance. Built of sturdy logs with a proper shingled roof, it featured a wide covered porch that wrapped around 2 sides. Flower beds, somewhat neglected but still showing evidence of careful planning, lined the front of the house. A stout woman with silver-streaked hair emerged onto the porch as the wagon approached, drying her hands on her apron. Behind her stood a lanky young man, perhaps 18 or 19, with a shock of red hair. That's Mrs. Wilkins and Zachary, one of my hands, York explained as he drew the wagon to a halt. Zach, see to the horses, he called out. Then, turning to the sisters, welcome to your new home. Mrs. Wilkins bustled down the steps, her keen eyes taking in the 4 sisters with unconcealed curiosity. So these are the Hayes girls, she said, her voice warm but assessing. Come in, come in. Supper's getting cold and you all look half-starved. Josephine helped Jennifer down from the wagon, then turned to find York already unloading their belongings. We can get those later, she started, but he shook his head. You go on in with Mrs. Wilkins. Zach and I will bring everything. Too tired to argue, Josephine followed the older woman into the house, her sisters trailing behind her. The interior was surprisingly warm and welcoming, with polished wooden floors, sturdy furniture, and colorful woven rugs. A massive stone fireplace dominated one wall of the main room, a cheerful fire crackling within it. Mrs. Wilkins led them through to a spacious kitchen where a large table was set with plates, cutlery, and glasses that sparkled in the lamplight. The aroma of roasted meat, fresh bread, and apple pie filled the air, causing Jennifer's stomach to rumble audibly. Sit, Mrs. Wilkins urged, already ladling thick stew into bowls. Eat while it's hot. The sisters needed no further encouragement. They fell upon the food with the desperate hunger of those who had been surviving on too little for too long. Josephine tried to maintain some decorum, reminding Julia and Jennifer to use their napkins, but her own hunger soon overcame her manners. York and Zachary entered as they were finishing their second helpings. The young ranch hand nodded shyly at the girls before accepting a bowl of stew from Mrs. Wilkins and retreating to a corner. York took a seat at the head of the table, watching with something like satisfaction as the sisters ate their fill. "Mrs. Wilkins," he said after a moment, "would you mind showing the girls to their rooms after supper? I've put them in the east wing." "Of course," the housekeeper replied. "I've already aired out the bedrooms and put fresh linens on all the beds." Jennifer looked up from her pie, eyes wide. "We really get our own beds." York's expression softened as he looked at the youngest Hayes sister. "Yes, little one. Your own beds in your own rooms." Later, after Mrs. Wilkins had shown them to their rooms, 4 adjacent chambers, each with a comfortable bed, washstand, and bureau, Josephine tucked Jennifer into bed and kissed her forehead. "Joey," the child whispered, already half asleep, "is this heaven?" Josephine smiled and smoothed her sister's hair. "No, sweetheart, but it's safe, and that's what matters." After checking on Jane and Julia, who were exploring their own rooms with expressions of wonder, Josephine found herself drawn back downstairs. The house was quiet now. Mrs. Wilkins had departed for her own cottage on the property, and Zachary had returned to the bunkhouse where the other hands stayed. She found York sitting alone by the fire, a ledger open on his knee and a glass of amber liquid in his hand. He looked up as she entered, closing the book and setting it aside. "Your sisters settled in?" he asked. Josephine nodded, remaining near the doorway. "Yes, thank you. They're overwhelmed by all of this." York gestured to a nearby chair. "Please sit if you'd like." After a moment's hesitation, she crossed the room and perched on the edge of the indicated seat. The firelight played across York's features, softening the hard lines and illuminating the weariness in his eyes. "Mr. Xerxes." "York," he corrected gently. "York," she amended. "I need to understand what's expected of me here. You said you needed help running the ranch, but surely not at the cost of the ranch itself." He studied her for a long moment before answering. "The deed remains in my name for now. Consider this an arrangement of mutual benefit. You and your sisters have a home, food, safety. In return, you help manage the household, which has been sorely neglected since my mother's passing." "And after a year," Josephine pressed. "What then?" York swirled the liquid in his glass. "Then you're free to stay or go as you choose. No obligation either way." It seemed too good to be true. Josephine searched his face for any sign of deception, but found only open honesty. "I don't understand your kindness," she admitted. Something flickered in York's eyes, a shadow of old pain. "Let's just say I recognize desperation when I see it." He set his glass down and stood. "It's late and tomorrow will bring plenty of work. You should rest." Josephine rose as well, sensing the conversation was over for now. "Good night then, and thank you again." As she climbed the stairs to her new bedroom, Josephine couldn't shake the feeling that York Xerxes was a far more complex man than his quiet demeanor suggested. Whatever his reasons for bringing them here, she was determined to earn her keep and protect her sisters. And perhaps, in time, she would unravel the mystery of the solitary rancher who had saved them from the brink of destitution. Dawn arrived with a chorus of roosters and the distant lowing of cattle. Josephine woke disoriented, momentarily confused by the unfamiliar comfort of the feather mattress and the sunlight streaming through actual glass windows, luxuries their cabin had lacked. Reality returned quickly, and with it, a renewed determination to prove her worth in this unexpected arrangement. She dressed in her best, though threadbare, dress and pinned her hair neatly before checking on her sisters. Jane was already awake, sitting by her window and staring out at the vast expanse of the ranch with an unreadable expression. Julia and Jennifer still slept soundly, their faces peaceful for the first time in months. "Let them rest," Josephine whispered to Jane. "They need it." Jane nodded, following her older sister into the hallway. "Joey," she said softly, "what's really going on here?" "Men don't just give away their homes to strangers." "He hasn't given it away," Josephine corrected. "He's offered us shelter in exchange for work. It's a fair arrangement." "Is it?" Jane's eyes narrowed. "What kind of work does he expect from you?" Josephine understood her sister's concern. "Not that kind," she assured her. "He made it very clear. We're here to help manage the household, nothing more." Though Jane looked unconvinced, she didn't press further. Together, they made their way downstairs, following the aroma of coffee and bacon to the kitchen. They found York already seated at the table, dressed in work clothes and studying what appeared to be a map of the property. Mrs. Wilkins bustled around the stove, humming to herself. "Good morning," York said, looking up as they entered. "Did you sleep well?" "Better than we have in months," Josephine admitted. "Thank you." Mrs. Wilkins turned, spatula in hand. "There you are, dears. Sit. Breakfast is nearly ready. Will the younger ones be joining us?" "They're still sleeping," Jane replied, her voice cautious but polite. "They've been exhausted." York nodded. "Let them rest. There's plenty of time." He folded the map and set it aside. "Mrs. Wilkins has been kind enough to prepare a list of household tasks that need attention. I thought perhaps you might want to review it after breakfast, Miss Hayes." "Josephine, please," she said, taking the seat he indicated. "And yes, I'd like to get started right away." Over a breakfast more bountiful than any they'd had since their parents' deaths, eggs, bacon, biscuits with fresh butter and honey, York outlined the basic workings of the ranch. 5 ranch hands, including young Zachary, managed the cattle and horses. Mrs. Wilkins came Monday, Wednesday, and Friday to cook and clean, but the rest of the time the house had been largely neglected. "The garden's gone wild," he admitted. "My mother had quite a way with plants, but I haven't had the time or the knowledge to maintain it properly." "I can help with that," Josephine offered. "Our garden at the cabin was small, but I managed to keep it producing." York nodded. "Good. There's also mending, preserving, and general upkeep that's fallen behind. And I thought perhaps your sisters might benefit from some schooling. There are books in the study. My mother was a teacher before she married." Jane spoke up for the first time. "I could teach the younger ones. Our mother taught me my letters and figures properly." "That would be a great help," York agreed, his expression warming slightly. "Education matters out here, even if some folk don't see it that way." After breakfast, Mrs. Wilkins showed Josephine around the house, pointing out areas that needed attention and explaining the storage arrangements for linens, preserves, and other household necessities. The kitchen was well equipped, with a modern cast iron stove, ample storage, and even an icebox, luxuries Josephine had only seen in town. "Mr. Xerxes is a good man," Mrs. Wilkins said as they inspected the pantry. "Quiet, keeps to himself too much for his own good, but decent through and through. His father was the same way, men of few words but solid actions." "How long have you known him?" Josephine asked, curious about her benefactor. "Since he was born," the older woman replied with a fond smile. "I worked for his parents from the beginning. Saw him grow from a squalling babe to the man he is now." Her expression grew serious. "He's had his share of sorrows, that one. Lost his parents too young, and then—" She paused, seeming to reconsider what she'd been about to say. "Well, it's not my place to tell his stories." Josephine's curiosity deepened, but she respected the housekeeper's discretion. "He seems very capable." "That he is. Runs this ranch better than most men twice his age could, but a home needs a woman's touch, and this place hasn't had that for too long." Mrs. Wilkins cast a shrewd glance at Josephine. Perhaps now it will again. Before Josephine could respond to the implication, Julia and Jennifer burst into the kitchen, their faces bright with excitement. "Joey, have you seen the horses?" Julia exclaimed. "There's a beautiful mare in the corral, and one of the ranch hands said she's gentle enough to ride." "And there's chickens," Jennifer added. "Dozens of them. A nice man named Walter let me collect the eggs." Josephine smiled at their enthusiasm. "I see you've been exploring." "Did you have breakfast?" "Mrs. Wilkins fed us," Jennifer assured her. "And Jane's setting up books in the study for lessons later." The morning passed quickly as Josephine familiarized herself with the house and its needs. By midday, she'd begun sorting through linens that needed mending, taken inventory of the pantry, and started planning meals for the days when Mrs. Wilkins wouldn't be there. York returned for dinner, the main meal served at midday looking dusty and tired from working with the cattle. He washed up at the pump outside before entering, his hair damp and his face clean but his clothes still bearing evidence of his morning's labor. "The north pasture fence needs repair," he informed Mrs. Wilkins as they sat down to eat. "I've sent Walter and Thomas to handle it, but they'll be late returning." The meal was simple but hearty beef stew, fresh bread, and apple preserves. Jennifer chattered happily about the chickens, while Julia described the books she'd discovered in the study. Even Jane seemed to have relaxed somewhat, offering occasional comments and watching York with less suspicion. "I was thinking," York said as they finished eating, "that perhaps you ladies might need some new clothes." He spoke carefully, as if concerned about causing offense. "There's a dressmaker in town who does good work. I could take you in the wagon on Saturday if you'd like." Josephine felt a flush of embarrassment at their shabby attire. "That's very generous, but consider it a necessary expense," York interrupted gently. "Proper clothes for the seasons are as important as food and shelter." After a moment's hesitation, Josephine nodded. "Thank you, that would be most helpful." In the afternoon, while Mrs. Wilkins taught Julia and Jennifer how to make apple tarts, Josephine ventured outside to examine the neglected garden. It was larger than she'd expected, with separate areas for vegetables, herbs, and flowers. Despite the overgrowth, she could see the careful planning that had gone into its design. She was on her knees, pulling weeds from around what appeared to be struggling tomato plants when a shadow fell across her work. Looking up, she found York watching her, his expression thoughtful. "My mother would be pleased to see someone tending her garden again," he said. Josephine brushed dirt from her hands as she stood. "It's a wonderful space. With some care, it could be producing well again by summer. I'd like that." He paused, seeming to struggle with what to say next. "My mother always said a garden needs love as much as water and sunlight. I couldn't give it that after she was gone." The simple admission revealed more about York than perhaps he'd intended. Josephine studied him, noting the way his shoulders carried an invisible weight. "Sometimes," she said carefully, "it's hard to nurture other things when your own heart is hurting." Something flickered in his eyes, surprise, perhaps, at being so easily rayed. "Yes," he agreed softly. "That's true enough." They stood in silence for a moment, the gentle spring breeze rustling through the overgrown plants around them. Finally, York cleared his throat. "I should get back to work. The western herd needs checking before sundown." "Of course," Josephine said. "Will you be back for supper?" "I'll try." He hesitated, then added, "Thank you for the garden, for understanding." Before she could respond, he turned and strode away toward the barn, his long legs covering the ground quickly. Josephine watched him go, feeling a curious warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with the afternoon sun. That evening, after a simple supper of cold meat, bread, and the apple tarts the girls had made, Josephine sat on the porch, enjoying the cool night air and the spectacular view of stars unimpeded by trees or buildings. The vastness of the night sky had always brought her comfort, even in the darkest times after their parents' deaths. The sound of boots on the wooden steps drew her attention. York emerged from the darkness, removing his hat as he approached. "May I join you?" he asked. Josephine nodded, shifting slightly on the bench to make room. York sat beside her, leaving a respectful distance between them. For several minutes they simply sat in companionable silence, gazing at the star-strewn sky. "Your sisters seem to be settling in," he observed eventually. "Yes," Josephine agreed. "Jennifer hasn't stopped smiling all day, and even Jane is beginning to relax. It's been difficult for them, for all of us." York nodded. "Loss changes people, children especially. You speak from experience." He was quiet for so long that Josephine thought he might not answer. Finally, he said, "I was 19 when my parents died, old enough to manage on my own but young enough to feel lost without them." "I'm sorry," Josephine said softly. "It's never easy, no matter the age." York's profile was sharp against the night sky as he stared out across his land. "After they were gone, I threw myself into running the ranch, worked from sunrise to sunset, fell into bed exhausted every night. It was easier than thinking than feeling." Josephine understood all too well. "I did the same. There was always another meal to prepare, more water to fetch, mending to be done. As long as I kept moving, I could pretend everything was fine. But it catches up to you eventually," York said, his voice low. "Yes," she whispered. "It does." They lapsed into silence again, but it was a comfortable one, born of shared understanding. The night air had grown cooler, and Josephine shivered slightly in her thin dress. Without comment, York removed his jacket and draped it gently over her shoulders. The garment was still warm from his body, and it carried his scent: leather, horses, and something uniquely him that she couldn't quite identify. "Thank you," she said, pulling the jacket closer around her. "You're welcome." He rose to his feet. "I should turn in. Dawn comes early." "Good night, York." He paused at her use of his first name, a small smile touching his lips. "Good night, Josephine." As his footsteps receded into the house, Josephine remained on the porch, wrapped in his jacket and the quiet night, wondering at the strange path that had led her here and where it might yet take her. The days began to establish a rhythm as April turned to May. Each morning, Josephine rose early to help prepare breakfast for York and the ranch hands before they headed out to their daily tasks. Jane took charge of the younger girls' education, setting up a makeshift classroom in the study where she taught them reading, writing, arithmetic, and history from the Xerxes' well-stocked bookshelves. Josephine divided her time between household management and restoring the garden to its former glory. The work was hard but satisfying, and she found herself humming as she planted new seedlings or hung freshly laundered sheets on the line to dry in the spring sunshine. York remained somewhat reserved, but each day brought small changes. He began to linger longer at the dinner table, listening to Jennifer's animated stories or discussing books with Julia. Sometimes Josephine would catch him watching her when he thought she wasn't looking, his expression unreadable but intense. On Saturday, true to his word, York drove them all into town in the wagon. The dressmaker, Mrs. Bennet, welcomed them warmly, having been forewarned of their arrival. While York excused himself to attend to other business, the sisters were measured and fitted for new dresses, undergarments, and even sturdy boots. "Mr. Xerxes said to spare no expense," Mrs. Bennet told Josephine with a knowing smile. "He's never brought ladies to my shop before." "You must be very special indeed." Josephine felt her cheeks warm. "We're simply working for him," she explained, "managing his household." "Of course, dear," the dressmaker replied, not bothering to hide her skepticism. That explains why he ordered an evening gown for you as well. He what? Josephine stared at the woman in surprise. Mrs. Bennet smiled as she jotted down measurements. A proper evening dress in emerald green silk. Said it would match your eyes. It's already ordered from Denver. Confused and somewhat flustered, Josephine said nothing more as the fitting continued. When York returned to collect them, she found herself watching him more closely, trying to discern his intentions. But his manner remained as respectful and reserved as ever, giving no hint of any deeper feelings. As they rode back to the ranch, Jennifer snuggled against York's side, already comfortable enough to treat him like family. "Will you teach me to ride a horse?" she asked, gazing up at him with hopeful eyes. "If your sister permits it," York replied, glancing at Josephine for approval. "Please, Joey," Jennifer pleaded. "I'll be careful." Josephine couldn't resist her youngest sister's enthusiasm. "I suppose it would be a useful skill to have," she conceded. "Can I learn too?" Julia asked eagerly. "Me as well," Jane added, surprising everyone. It was the first request she'd made since arriving at the ranch. York's smile was genuine. "I'd be happy to teach all of you. We'll start tomorrow with the gentlest mare in the stable." The next day dawned clear and warm. After breakfast, York led the sisters to the corral where a chestnut mare waited patiently, already saddled. "This is Maple," he said, stroking the horse's neck. "She's been with us for 12 years and has the sweetest disposition of any horse I've known." For the next hour, he patiently instructed each sister in the basics of horsemanship, how to approach the animal, how to mount and dismount, how to use the reins to guide her. Jennifer took to it immediately, her natural fearlessness serving her well. Julia was more cautious but determined. Jane, despite her initial request, seemed nervous around the large animal but persisted nonetheless. When Josephine's turn came, York stood closer than he had with her sisters, one hand resting lightly on her waist as she settled into the saddle. "Keep your back straight," he instructed, his voice low near her ear. "That's it. Now hold the reins like this." His hand covered hers briefly, adjusting her grip. "Not too tight but firm enough to communicate your intent." Josephine was acutely aware of his proximity, of the strength in the hands that guided hers, of the warmth of his breath against her cheek. When she finally gathered the courage to look down at him, she found his blue eyes focused on her with an intensity that made her breath catch. For a moment, neither of them moved or spoke, then Maple shifted beneath her, breaking the spell. "You're a natural," York said, stepping back. "Try walking her around the corral once." As Josephine guided the mare in a slow circle, she felt York's eyes following her the entire way. Something had changed between them in that brief moment, a recognition, perhaps, of feelings neither of them had yet acknowledged aloud. The riding lessons continued each Sunday after church, which York insisted on attending despite admitting he hadn't been a regular worshiper since his parents' deaths. "It's the proper thing," he explained as they all crowded into the wagon in their new Sunday best. "And the community should know you're under my protection." The word protection lingered in Josephine's mind as they entered the small white church in Wytrock. She was keenly aware of the curious glances and whispers that followed their arrival, particularly when York ushered them into his family's pew near the front. "That's Josephine Hayes," she overheard one woman whispering to another. "The one who was auctioning herself at Holloway's Saloon. And now she's living at the Xerxes ranch with her sisters," another added. "Though who knows what really goes on out there." Josephine kept her gaze forward, refusing to acknowledge the gossip. Beside her, York seemed oblivious, but the slight stiffening of his posture suggested he heard every word. After the service, Several townspeople approached to introduce themselves, their curiosity barely concealed behind polite smiles. York remained close to Josephine's side, his presence both comforting and a clear statement to anyone watching. "Miss Hayes," said a well-dressed woman with sharp eyes and a pinched mouth, "I'm Margaret Sullivan, president of the Ladies' Aid Society. We were quite surprised to hear of your new living arrangement." Before Josephine could respond, York spoke up. "Miss Hayes and her sisters are managing my household, Mrs. Sullivan, an arrangement that benefits us all." "I see," the woman replied, though her tone suggested she saw something else entirely. "Well, Miss Hayes, should you find yourself in need of more appropriate employment, do let me know. The hotel is always looking for chambermaids." Josephine forced a smile. "Thank you for your concern, Mrs. Sullivan, but I'm quite content with my current position." As they walked away, York placed his hand briefly at the small of Josephine's back, a subtle gesture of support that did not go unnoticed by the watching townsfolk. "I'm sorry," he murmured. "Small towns breed big gossip." "It doesn't matter," Josephine assured him, though the encounters had left her feeling exposed and judged. "I know the truth of our arrangement." York's expression darkened. "The truth is that you're a respectable woman doing honest work to support your family. Anyone who suggests otherwise will answer to me." The protective fierceness in his voice warmed her, even as she worried about the rumors their unusual living situation would inevitably generate. Later that evening, after the younger girls had gone to bed, Josephine found herself alone with York in the study. He sat behind his father's desk, reviewing cattle ledgers, while she mended one of his shirts by the light of an oil lamp. "York," she said hesitantly, "I've been thinking about what happened in town today." He looked up from his work, waiting for her to continue. Perhaps it would be better if Mrs. Wilkins stayed at the house full-time, at least for appearance's sake. York considered this for a moment. "Would that make you more comfortable?" "It's not about my comfort," Josephine explained. "It's about my sisters. I don't want them tainted by gossip because of my decisions." York set down his pen and leaned back in his chair. "I understand your concern, but I don't think it's necessary." "This is the frontier, Josephine. Unconventional arrangements are more common than not." He paused. "Unless. Are you uncomfortable being here with me?" "No," she answered truthfully. "That's not it at all." "Then let people talk," he said simply. "Those who matter know the truth." Josephine nodded, returning to her mending. They worked in companionable silence for some time before York spoke again. "There's a social at the town hall next Saturday, a spring dance." He kept his eyes on his ledger as he spoke. "I thought perhaps you and your sisters might enjoy attending." Josephine looked up in surprise. "All of us? Why not? Jane's of an age where she might enjoy dancing, and the younger ones would have fun with the games and refreshments." He finally met her gaze. "And I thought, perhaps you might save a dance for me." The request, delivered so casually yet with an undercurrent of uncertainty, made Josephine's heart flutter unexpectedly. "I'd like that," she said softly. A small smile touched York's lips. "Good." He returned to his ledgers, but Josephine noticed he seemed more relaxed than before. As she prepared for bed that night, Josephine found herself thinking about the dance and about York. In the 6 weeks since he'd brought them to his ranch, she'd come to respect his quiet strength, his unfailing kindness to her sisters, and the integrity evident in everything he did. And if she were honest with herself, there was something more developing feelings she hadn't expected to experience for the solitary rancher. Whether York shared those feelings remained unclear. There were moments like today during the riding lesson, or his request for a dance that suggested he might. But he remained reserved, keeping a careful distance that Josephine couldn't quite interpret. The next morning brought an unexpected change to their routine. As Josephine was preparing breakfast, a rider approached the ranch at a gallop. Through the kitchen window, she saw York hurry from the barn to meet him. Their conversation appeared urgent, with much gesturing toward the northern hills. When York entered the kitchen moments later, his expression was grim. "Rustlers hit the Blackwell place last night," he announced. "Took nearly a third of their herd. Tom Bennett's organizing a posse to go after them." "You're going?" Josephine asked, already knowing the answer. York nodded, reaching for his gun belt hanging by the door. "Rustling hurts everyone in the territory. If they get away with it at one ranch, others will follow." Concern tightened Josephine's chest. "When will you return?" "Hard to say. Could be tonight, could be a few days if the trail's difficult to follow." He buckled the gun belt around his waist. "Walter will stay behind to watch over the place. If there's any trouble, send Zach to town for the sheriff." "Be careful," Josephine said, the words carrying more emotion than she'd intended. York paused in the doorway, his eyes meeting hers. "I will." After a moment's hesitation, he added, "Josephine, if something happens to me, don't," she interrupted, unable to bear the thought. "You'll come back safely." "I plan to," he assured her, "but if I don't, you should know that I've made arrangements. The ranch would pass to you and your sisters." Josephine stared at him in shock. "York, it's all written out proper with my lawyer in town," he continued, "just in case." Before she could formulate a response, he was gone, the sound of hoofbeats rapidly fading as he rode to join the posse. Josephine stood in the doorway watching until he disappeared from sight, her heart heavy with unspoken words and sudden fear. The day passed with agonizing slowness. Josephine went through the motions of her usual tasks, but her mind kept wandering to York and the dangers he might be facing. Rustlers were often desperate men, willing to kill to protect their stolen livestock. That night, as she tucked Jennifer into bed, the young girl asked, "Is York going to be all right?" Josephine smoothed her sister's hair. "Of course he is. He's very capable." "Good," Jennifer said sleepily, "because I think he'd make a wonderful brother." The innocent comment caught Josephine off guard. "What makes you say that?" Jennifer yawned. "Because he looks at you the way Papa used to look at Mama, like you're the sun and moon all together." Josephine kissed her sister's forehead, unsure how to respond. "Sleep now, little one." Later, unable to rest, Josephine found herself standing on the porch, staring into the darkness as if she could will York to appear. The night was cool, and she pulled his jacket, which she'd never returned, tighter around her shoulders. "He'll be fine," came Jane's voice from behind her. "He strikes me as a man who can take care of himself." Josephine turned to her sister with a small smile. "When did you become his defender? I thought you didn't trust him." Jane shrugged, leaning against the porch railing. "I've been watching him. The way he treats us treats you." "He's a good man, Joey," she paused, "and I think he cares for you more than he lets on." "Perhaps," Josephine admitted, looking back toward the darkened landscape, "though he keeps his feelings well guarded." "Some men do," Jane replied with wisdom beyond her years. "Especially those who have known loss." They stood together in silence for a while, the night sounds of the ranch surrounding them, distant lowing of cattle, the occasional whinny from the stable, crickets singing in the tall grass. "I like it here," Jane said eventually. "I didn't think I would, but I do." Josephine smiled at this admission. "I'm glad. It's becoming home, isn't it?" Jane nodded. "It is, and not just because of the comforts." She hesitated, then added softly, "For the first time since Mama and Papa died, I feel safe again." Tears pricked at Josephine's eyes as she pulled her sister into a hug. "That's all I ever wanted for you, for all of you." "I know," Jane whispered. "And you made it happen, Joey, even if it meant standing on that auction platform." The memory still brought shame, but Josephine pushed it aside. Let's hope that's behind us now. 2 more days passed with no word from York or the posse. Josephine tried to maintain a brave face for her sisters, but her worry grew with each passing hour. Walter assured her that such pursuits often took time, especially if the rustlers had headed into the rugged hill country to the north. On the morning of the 3rd day, as Josephine was hanging laundry on the line, she heard hoofbeats approaching. Shielding her eyes from the sun, she made out a single rider coming toward the ranch at a steady pace. Her heart leapt with hope, then faltered as she realized it wasn't York's familiar silhouette. As the rider drew closer, she recognized Thomas, one of the younger ranch hands who had gone with the posse. He dismounted wearily, his clothes dusty and his face grim. "Miss Hayes," he said, removing his hat, "I've come to fetch supplies and fresh horses. What news?" Josephine asked, her throat tight with apprehension. "Is everyone all right?" Thomas looked uncomfortable. "We tracked the rustlers into the hill country like Mr. Xerxes thought we might, found their camp yesterday morning." "And," Josephine prompted when he fell silent, "there was a confrontation." Thomas shifted his weight. Shots were fired. Mr. Xerxes took a bullet to the shoulder. Josephine felt the blood drain from her face. "How bad is it?" "Doc Miller's with him now," Thomas assured her quickly. "Says it went clean through, which is good. But there's fever setting in, and the doc thought it best not to move him yet. They're holed up at an old line shack about 15 miles north of here." "I'm going to him," Josephine decided immediately. "Can you saddle a horse for me?" Thomas looked uncertain. "Miss Hayes, I don't think—" "I wasn't asking permission," Josephine interrupted, her voice firm. "Saddle a horse, please, and I'll need supplies, clean linens, food, medicine if we have any." Recognizing her determination, Thomas nodded. "Yes, madam, I'll have a horse ready in 10 minutes." Josephine hurried into the house to inform Jane of the situation and pack necessary supplies. "I'm trusting you to look after Julia and Jennifer," she told her sister. "I don't know how long I'll be gone." "We'll manage," Jane assured her. "Just bring him home safely." Within half an hour, Josephine was mounted on Maple, a pack of supplies secured behind the saddle, following Thomas back toward the hills. They rode hard, stopping only briefly to rest the horses. The terrain grew increasingly rugged as they left the open grasslands behind and entered the foothills. By mid-afternoon, they reached a small clearing where a weathered cabin stood, smoke curling from its chimney. Several horses were tethered nearby, and men sat outside, some cleaning weapons while others dozed in the afternoon sun. They looked up as Josephine and Thomas approached, surprise evident on their faces at the sight of a woman in their remote camp. Sheriff Davis, a stout man with a thick mustache, stepped forward to meet them. "Miss Hayes," he said, removing his hat, "this is unexpected. How is he?" Josephine asked without preamble, already dismounting. "Holding his own," the sheriff replied. "Doc's with him now." Without waiting for further discussion, Josephine grabbed her bundle of supplies and headed for the cabin. Inside, the air was warm and close, smelling of smoke, sweat, and the metallic tang of blood. In the dim light, she made out a narrow cot in one corner where a man lay still, his upper body bare except for a bandage wrapped around his left shoulder. Doc Miller, a gray-haired man with kind eyes, sat beside him, wringing out a cloth in a basin of water. "Miss Hayes," the doctor said, surprise evident in his tone. "I didn't expect to see you here." Josephine barely heard him, her attention fixed on York. His face was flushed with fever, his breathing shallow. She moved to his side, her heart twisting at the sight of him so vulnerable. "How bad is it?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "The bullet went through clean," Doc Miller explained, "but there's infection setting in." I've cleaned the wound as best I can and given him laudanum for the pain, but the fever's concerning." Josephine set down her bundle and began unpacking fresh linens. "I'll stay with him." The doctor studied her for a moment, then nodded. "Very well. Change the bandages every few hours. Keep the wound clean. Try to get water into him when he's conscious enough to swallow. If the fever hasn't broken by morning, we may have more serious problems." After providing a few more instructions, the doctor left to check on another man who'd been injured in the confrontation with the rustlers. Josephine pulled a stool up to York's bedside and gently placed her hand on his forehead, wincing at the heat radiating from his skin. "York," she said softly. "It's Josephine. I'm here now." His eyelids fluttered but didn't open. She dipped a cloth in the cool water and began bathing his face and neck, speaking to him quietly all the while. As she worked, she found herself telling him things she'd never said aloud: how grateful she was for his kindness, how she admired his strength and integrity, how the ranch had begun to feel like home in a way their cabin never had. "You have to get better," she whispered, her voice breaking slightly. "There's a dance on Saturday, remember? You asked for a dance and I intend to hold you to it." The hours passed slowly. Josephine tended to York with unwavering attention, changing his bandages, coaxing water between his lips when he was semi-conscious, and constantly bathing his fevered skin with cool cloths. Night fell, and someone brought her a plate of beans and coffee, which she barely touched. In the darkest hours, York's fever spiked dangerously. He began to mutter and thrash, calling out names Josephine didn't recognize. She held his hand tightly, speaking calmly to anchor him through his delirium. "Rebecca," he called once, his voice anguished. "Don't go, please." Josephine felt a pang of something like jealousy, quickly followed by shame for such a petty emotion when York was suffering. "Shh," she soothed. "Rest now." Near dawn, as Josephine was fighting her own exhaustion, York's eyes suddenly opened, clear and focused for the first time since her arrival. "Josephine," he whispered hoarsely, "are you really here?" Relief flooded through her. "Yes," she assured him, squeezing his hand. "I'm here." "You shouldn't be," he said, though his fingers tightened around hers. "It's not safe." "Hush," she replied, brushing damp hair from his forehead. "Where else would I be when you're hurt?" A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Stubborn woman." "Look who's talking," she countered gently. "The man who chased armed rustlers into the hills." York's eyes began to drift closed again, but before sleep claimed him, he murmured, "Glad you came." By morning, his fever had broken. Doc Miller pronounced him out of immediate danger, though still in need of rest and care. The sheriff reported that they'd recovered most of the stolen cattle and captured 2 of the rustlers, though 3 others had escaped into the more rugged terrain. "We'll get them eventually," he assured Josephine. "Meanwhile, we need to get your man home where he can heal properly." "Your man." The casual phrase sent a flutter through Josephine's chest, but she didn't correct the sheriff. Instead, she helped prepare a travois to transport York back to the ranch, insisting on riding alongside him the entire journey. They arrived home late that afternoon to find Jane, Julia, and Jennifer waiting anxiously on the porch. Walter and Zach helped carry York to his bedroom, a room Josephine had never entered before. It was simply furnished but comfortable, with a large 4-poster bed that had clearly been built for a man of York's height. "I'll stay with him," Josephine told Doc Miller as the older man prepared to leave. "You've shown me what to do." The doctor nodded. "Send for me if the fever returns or if the wound shows signs of worsening. Otherwise, rest and good care should see him healed in a few weeks." For the next several days, Josephine divided her time between her regular duties and caring for York. She enlisted Jane's help with the household management, while Julia and Jennifer took turns reading to York when he was awake enough to listen. On the third evening after their return, when York was finally able to sit up and take proper meals, Josephine brought him a tray with beef broth, fresh bread, and tea. "You're spoiling me," he said as she arranged the tray across his lap. "Nonsense," she replied. "You do the same for any of us." York caught her hand as she adjusted his pillows. "Josephine," he said, his voice serious, "thank you for coming to the line shack, for taking care of me," she smiled. "That's what friends do, isn't it? Is that what we are, friends?" There was a question in his eyes that went beyond the simple words. Before Josephine could respond, Jennifer burst into the room, eager to show York a drawing she'd made of Maple. The moment passed, but the question lingered in Josephine's mind long after she'd retired to her own room for the night. By Saturday, the day of the town's social, York was well enough to move around the house, though Doc Miller had strictly forbidden him from riding or any strenuous activity. He insisted, however, that Josephine and her sisters should still attend the dance. "There's no reason for all of you to miss it," he argued when Josephine expressed reluctance to leave him. "Walter can drive you in the wagon." "It wouldn't feel right," Josephine admitted. "Not without you." Something softened in York's expression. "Then I suppose we'll have our own celebration here," he decided. "Tell Walter to bring back some of Mrs. Peterson's apple cider from town, and perhaps we could clear some space in the parlor." That evening, after Walter had returned with the requested cider and news from town, the parlor furniture was pushed aside to create an impromptu dance floor. York sat in an armchair, his injured arm in a sling, while Josephine wound up the phonograph, another of Mrs. Xerxes' prized possessions. As the music filled the room, Julia and Jennifer twirled around the floor, giggling as they bumped into each other. Even Jane allowed Zachary, who had been invited to join them, to lead her in a simple waltz, her cheeks flushed with unaccustomed excitement. "This is much better than some stuffy town social," Jennifer declared as she collapsed, breathless, onto a sofa. York smiled at her enthusiasm. "I'm glad you think so." His eyes found Josephine, who stood near the phonograph. "Though I'm sorry to have deprived you all of a proper dance." "This is perfect," Josephine assured him. She hesitated, then added softly, "though I do regret missing that dance you asked for." York's gaze held hers for a long moment. Then, to everyone's surprise, he stood and crossed the room to her side, moving carefully but with determination. "York, you shouldn't," Josephine began, concerned for his injury. "One dance," he said, holding out his right hand to her. "I believe I was promised one dance." The music changed to a slower melody, and Josephine placed her hand in his. With gentle care, he drew her into a simple box step, maintaining a proper distance due to his injured shoulder but still close enough that she could feel the warmth of him. "This isn't wise," she murmured, though she made no move to pull away. "Probably not," he agreed, a smile touching his lips. "But some things are worth the risk." They moved together in perfect harmony, as if they'd danced 100 times before. Josephine was acutely aware of his hand at her waist, of the subtle scent of soap and something uniquely him, of the way his eyes never left her face. When the music ended, neither of them immediately stepped apart. For a heartbeat, Josephine thought he might kiss her, hoped he might, but the moment was broken by Jennifer's delighted applause. "You dance beautifully together," the child exclaimed. York released Josephine with evident reluctance. "Thank you for the dance, Miss Hayes," he said formally, though his eyes conveyed something far more personal. "The pleasure was mine, Mr. Xerxes," she replied, matching his tone while her heart raced with unspoken feelings. As May turned to June, York's recovery progressed steadily. The emerald silk dress Mrs. Bennet had mentioned arrived from Denver, just as exquisite as promised. When Josephine questioned him about it, York simply said, Every woman should have one beautiful dress, and would say no more on the subject. The garden flourished under Josephine's care, providing fresh vegetables for their table. Jane continued teaching her younger sisters, adding lessons in running a household as Josephine showed her what she'd learned. Julia discovered a talent for baking, while Jennifer became Walter's shadow, learning about the animals and helping with the smaller chores around the ranch. And throughout it all, something continued to grow between Josephine and York, unspoken, but increasingly undeniable. There were lingering glances across the dinner table, hands that touched a moment longer than necessary when passing dishes, conversations that stretched late into the evening after the younger girls had gone to bed. Yet neither of them seemed ready to acknowledge what was happening. Josephine, mindful of her vulnerable position and her responsibility to her sisters, hesitated to believe that a man like York could truly care for someone like her, a woman who had nearly sold herself to feed her family. And York, for reasons of his own, maintained a certain restraint despite the growing affection evident in his every interaction with her. One evening in late June, as Josephine sat on the porch watching a spectacular sunset paint the western sky in shades of gold and crimson, York joined her, 2 glasses of lemonade in hand. "Beautiful, isn't it?" he said, offering her one of the glasses before taking a seat beside her on the bench. "It never gets old," she agreed. "The sunsets here are like nothing I've ever seen." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, sipping their lemonade and watching the colors deepen and fade as twilight approached. Fireflies began to appear, their tiny lights flickering in the gathering dusk. "My mother used to say that fireflies were the stars' younger siblings," York said softly. "Too impatient to wait for full dark." Josephine smiled at the whimsical thought. "I like that. My father told us they were fairies carrying lanterns. Your father sounds like he had a good imagination." "He did." Josephine's smile turned bittersweet. "He was a wonderful storyteller. Every night before bed, he'd tell us tales of brave knights and clever princesses. Sometimes I think that's what Jennifer misses most, his stories." York nodded in understanding. "My father wasn't one for stories, but he taught me to read the land, to understand the rhythms of the seasons. Said a man who knows his land will never truly be poor." "He was right," Josephine said, gesturing to the vast expanse of the ranch spread out before them. "This land, it's special. I felt it the first day we arrived." "It is," York agreed. He hesitated, then added, "It's changed since you came, feels more alive somehow." Josephine glanced at him, surprised by the admission. The land, the house." He met her gaze steadily. "Everything." The weight of unspoken meaning hung between them. Josephine's heart quickened as York shifted slightly closer on the bench. "Josephine," he began, his voice deeper than usual. "There's something I need to—" "York." "Joey," Jennifer's voice called from inside the house. "Julia's cake is ready, and she says if we don't come now, she'll eat it all herself." The moment shattered like fine glass. York sighed, a rueful smile touching his lips. "We'd better go in before we're left without dessert." Josephine nodded, trying to hide her disappointment. "Julia's quite serious about her cakes." As they rose to go inside, York caught her hand briefly. "Another time," he said softly, the promise clear in his eyes. 2 days later, that promise remained unfulfilled as York was called away to help a neighboring ranch with a difficult calving. He returned late in the evening, too exhausted for more than a brief good night before retiring to his room. The following morning brought an unexpected visitor to the ranch. Josephine was in the garden, harvesting peas, when she heard a carriage approaching. Setting aside her basket, she shaded her eyes against the morning sun to see a fine buggy being driven by an elegant woman perhaps a few years older than herself. The visitor drew the carriage to a halt near the house and descended gracefully, smoothing her fashionable traveling dress. Her hair was a rich auburn, styled in the latest fashion, and her bearing suggested wealth and social standing. "Good morning," Josephine called, approaching with a friendly smile despite her curiosity. "May I help you?" The woman turned, her green eyes widening slightly as she took in Josephine's simple dress and garden-soiled hands. "I'm looking for York Xerxes," she said, her voice cultured but cool. "Is he available?" "He should be in the barn," Josephine replied. "May I tell him who's calling?" A slight frown creased the woman's perfect brow. Rebecca Aldridge, an old friend. Rebecca. The name York had called out in his delirium. Josephine felt a chill despite the warm morning sun. "I'll fetch him for you," she offered, keeping her voice neutral. "Would you care to wait on the porch? It's cooler there." "Thank you," Rebecca replied, her assessing gaze still on Josephine. "And you are?" "Josephine Hayes. I manage Mr. Xerxes' household." Recognition flashed in Rebecca's eyes. "Ah, yes, the woman from the auction. How interesting." The deliberate pause made it clear what Rebecca really thought of Josephine's position. With a tight smile, Josephine excused herself and hurried toward the barn, her mind racing with questions. She found York checking a horse's injured leg, his sleeves rolled up and his focus complete. He looked up as she approached, a smile warming his features until he saw her expression. "What's wrong?" he asked immediately, straightening. "You have a visitor," Josephine said, hating the slight tremor in her voice. "Rebecca Aldridge." York went very still, the color draining from his face. "Rebecca is here." "Now," Josephine nodded. "She's waiting on the porch. She said she's an old friend." For a moment, York seemed at a loss for words. Then he passed a hand over his face as if trying to compose himself. "Thank you for telling me," he said finally, his voice carefully neutral. "Would you ask Mrs. Wilkins to prepare some refreshments? I'll be there shortly." "Of course," Josephine replied, fighting to keep her own tone even. She turned to go, then paused. "York, who is she to you?" York met her gaze, something like regret in his eyes. "It's complicated," he said after a moment, "but I promise I'll explain everything later." Unsatisfied but unwilling to press further, Josephine nodded and headed back to the house. She informed Mrs. Wilkins of the guest, then busied herself in the kitchen, deliberately avoiding the porch where Rebecca waited. Soon she heard York's voice greeting the visitor, followed by the sound of them entering the house and moving to the parlor. The next hour was torture for Josephine. She found tasks to keep herself occupied, but her mind continued to circle back to the beautiful, refined woman in the parlor and to York's reaction upon hearing her name. Something significant existed between them, that much was clear. When the parlor door finally opened, Josephine was arranging flowers in the dining room. She couldn't help but overhear as York escorted Rebecca to the front door. "Consider my offer, York," Rebecca was saying, her voice carrying clearly. "Father's willing to forgive the past. The position at the bank is still yours if you want it. We could start fresh in Denver, away from all the painful memories." "It's generous of your father," York replied, his tone unreadable, "but my life is here now." "Is it?" Rebecca challenged softly. "Or are you still punishing yourself for something that wasn't your fault?" There was a pause, then York said, "I'll think about it, Rebecca. That's all I can promise. That's all I ask." Another pause then. "She's pretty, your housekeeper, but hardly suitable for a man of your background." "Father would never approve." "My father's approval is no longer something I need to concern myself with," York replied, an edge entering his voice. "Good day, Rebecca." After the front door closed, Josephine heard York's footsteps pause in the hallway. For a moment, she thought he might come find her, but then he moved toward his study, the door closing firmly behind him. Josephine remained where she was, the half-arranged flowers forgotten as she tried to make sense of what she'd overheard. Who was Rebecca to York? What painful memories did they share? And what had she meant about York punishing himself? The questions haunted her throughout the day. York remained in his study until dinner time, emerging with a distant expression that discouraged conversation. The meal passed in unusual silence, with even Jennifer sensing the tension and keeping her usual chatter subdued. After the younger girls had gone to bed, Josephine found herself once again on the porch, seeking solace in the night air and the distant chorus of frogs and crickets. She wasn't entirely surprised when the door opened behind her and York stepped out. "May I join you?" he asked quietly. Josephine nodded, moving to make room on the bench. York sat beside her closer than usual, their shoulders almost touching. "I owe you an explanation," he began after a moment of silence. "You don't owe me anything," Josephine replied, though her heart contradicted her words. York turned to face her, his expression earnest in the moonlight. "Yes, I do. You deserve to know the truth." He took a deep breath. "Rebecca and I were engaged to be married 5 years ago. Though she'd suspected something of the sort, the confirmation still stung." "I see. Her father is a banker in Denver, a very wealthy, influential man. He never approved of me, despite my family's land holdings. Thought his daughter could do better than a rancher." York's voice held old bitterness, but Rebecca was headstrong. She insisted on the engagement. Josephine remained silent, waiting for him to continue. "We were to be married in the spring of '74, York went on. "Everything was arranged. Then the influenza came." His voice grew rough with remembered pain. "It swept through the territory like wildfire. My parents fell ill first. Despite the risk, Rebecca came to help care for them. She was very kind during that time." Josephine could guess what came next. "She became ill as well." York nodded. "Along with her younger brother, who had accompanied her on one of her visits. My parents recovered, but Rebecca's brother died." His hands clenched into fists on his knees. "Her father blamed me, said I should have prevented her from coming to a house of sickness. He forbade the marriage." "That hardly seems fair," Josephine said softly. "Perhaps not, but I blamed myself too." York stared into the darkness. "If I hadn't been so selfish, so determined to have her despite her father's objections, her brother might still be alive." "You couldn't have known," Josephine argued. "Disease doesn't discriminate. It wasn't your fault." York's smile was sad. "That's what my parents said, but the damage was done. Rebecca returned to Denver with her family. I threw myself into running the ranch, especially after my parents passed the following winter a relapse of the influenza," the doctor said. "And now she's returned," Josephine concluded, "with an offer from her father." "Yes. Apparently time has softened his anger. He's offering me a position at his bank in Denver and Rebecca." He hesitated. "She suggests we might resume our engagement." The words landed like stones in Josephine's heart. "I see," she said again, struggling to keep her voice steady. "That's quite an opportunity." York studied her face in the moonlight. "Is it? A banking position in Denver, a marriage based on old obligations and guilt. If you still care for her." "I don't," York interrupted firmly. "What I felt for Rebecca died years ago. Perhaps it would have faded anyway, even without the tragedy. We were very young and not as well suited as we believed." Hope flickered in Josephine's chest, but she tamped it down. "Then why consider her offer at all?" York was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. "Because sometimes I wonder if I deserve this." He gestured to the ranch spread out before them. "All this peace, this beauty, the happiness I've found here." His eyes met hers. "The happiness I've found with you." The simple admission made Josephine's breath catch. "York, let me finish," he said gently. "When I saw you on that platform at Holloway's, something happened to me, Josephine. Something I can't explain. It was like recognizing a part of myself I didn't know was missing. He reached for her hand, his calloused fingers closing around hers. These past months, watching you bring my home back to life, seeing how you care for your sisters, learning your strength and your kindness. I've come to care for you in a way I never thought possible again. Josephine's heart thundered in her chest. I've come to care for you too, she admitted softly. More than I should, perhaps. Why shouldn't you? York asked, his thumb tracing gentle circles on her palm. Because of how we met, because of what I was willing to do. Shame colored her voice. What kind of woman auctions herself to the highest bidder? A brave one, York answered without hesitation. A woman who would sacrifice anything for those she loves. He lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. That's who you are, Josephine Hayes. Not what desperation drove you to do on one dark day. Tears pricked at Josephine's eyes. You make it sound so simple. It is simple, York insisted. At least this part. He moved closer, one hand coming up to gently cup her cheek. I love you, Josephine. I think I have almost from the beginning. The words, spoken with such quiet certainty, washed over her like warm rain after drought. York, she whispered, her own feelings too overwhelming to articulate. He seemed to understand nonetheless. Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, he leaned forward and brushed his lips against hers in a kiss so gentle it was barely more than a breath. Josephine responded instinctively, her hand coming up to rest against his chest as she returned the kiss with equal tenderness. When they finally parted, York rested his forehead against hers, his eyes closed as if memorizing the moment. I'm not going to Denver, he murmured. My place is here, with you if you'll have me. Yes, Josephine answered without hesitation. Yes, I'll have you. York's smile was luminous in the moonlight as he drew her into his arms, holding her as if she were precious beyond measure. And in that moment, with the vast Montana sky stretching endlessly above them and their ranch spreading out around them, Josephine knew she had found her true home at last. The following morning, Josephine woke to sunshine streaming through her window and a heart lighter than it had been in years. For a moment, she lay still, savoring the memory of York's kiss and his declaration of love. It seemed almost too perfect to be real. A soft knock at her door roused her from her reverie. Joey, came Jennifer's voice. Are you awake? York says there's a surprise downstairs. Curious, Josephine dressed quickly and made her way to the kitchen, where she found her sisters already gathered around the table. York stood by the stove, looking slightly nervous but pleased with himself. Good morning, he greeted, his eyes warming as they met hers. I hope you slept well. Very well, thank you, she replied, a blush coloring her cheeks at the private smile they shared. York made breakfast, Jennifer announced excitedly. All by himself. Josephine surveyed the table with surprise. A platter of somewhat misshapen pancakes sat in the center, surrounded by dishes of butter, honey, and fresh berries. The coffee in the pot smelled stronger than usual, and the bacon was definitely crispier than Mrs. Wilkins would have allowed, but the effort was touching. I'm impressed, Josephine said sincerely, taking her seat. I didn't know you could cook. York grinned sheepishly. I wouldn't call it cooking exactly, but a man living alone learns the basics. He sat down beside her, closer than he would have just yesterday. I thought we might all ride into town after breakfast. There's something I need to attend to. The mysterious errand turned out to be a visit to Mr. Williams, York's lawyer. While the younger girls explored the shops under Jane's watchful eye, York led Josephine into the lawyer's office, explaining that he wanted to formalize the arrangements he'd mentioned before leaving with the posse. But you're fully recovered now, Josephine protested. There's no need to, there's every need, York insisted. Life on a ranch is unpredictable. I want to be certain that you and your sisters will always be secure, no matter what happens. The lawyer, a balding man with spectacles perched on his nose, greeted them warmly. "Mr. Xerxes, Miss Hayes, please be seated. I have the papers ready as requested." As Mr. Williams explained the documents, Josephine's eyes widened in surprise. York wasn't simply naming her as the beneficiary of his will, he was adding her name to the deed of the ranch itself. "York, I can't accept this," she whispered. "It's too much." He took her hand, unconcerned about the lawyer's presence. "It's not a gift, Josephine. It's recognition of what's already true. This ranch is as much yours now as it is mine. You've poured your heart and soul into it, just as I have." Seeing her continued hesitation, York's expression softened. "Besides," he added quietly, "I have hopes that your name won't be Hayes for much longer." The implication sent a jolt of joy through Josephine. With trembling hands, she signed where Mr. Williams indicated, still hardly believing that she who had stood on an auction block mere months ago was now becoming joint owner of one of the finest ranches in the territory. As they left the lawyer's office, York drew her into the shade of a nearby alley, away from curious eyes. "There's something else I want to ask you," he said, suddenly looking less confident than she'd ever seen him. "Something I've been thinking about for weeks now." Josephine's heart quickened. "Yes." York took both her hands in his. "I know it's soon, perhaps too soon by conventional standards, but I think we both know that what's between us is real and true." He took a deep breath. "Josephine Hayes, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" Though she'd suspected what he might ask after his comment in the lawyer's office, hearing the actual proposal still took her breath away. "York," she managed finally, "are you certain? There must be dozens of women more suitable." "There is no one more suitable," he interrupted firmly. "No one I could ever love as I love you." Tears of happiness blurred Josephine's vision. "Then yes, yes, I will marry you." York's face lit with a joy that transformed his usually reserved features. He pulled her into his arms, kissing her with a passion that left no doubt of his feelings. When they finally parted, both breathless, he pressed his forehead to hers. "I never thought I'd find love again," he admitted softly. "Never thought I deserved it. Then you stood on that auction platform, proud even in your desperation, and changed everything." Josephine smiled through her tears. "And I never thought I'd find a home again after losing our parents. But you gave us that, and so much more." They returned to the main street to find Jane, Julia, and Jennifer waiting outside the general store. One look at their glowing faces told Jane everything. "Finally," she said with a knowing smile. "I was beginning to think you'd both be stubborn forever." Jennifer bounced on her toes with excitement. "Does this mean York will be our brother now?" York laughed, lifting the child into his arms. "Better than that, little one. I'll be your brother-in-law, but you can just call me York, same as always." The ride home was filled with excited chatter as the younger girls peppered them with questions about the wedding. Would it be in the church? Could they have new dresses? Would there be cake? "We should be married soon," York suggested as they approached the ranch. "Before summer's end." "There's no reason to wait, is there?" Josephine agreed. With her sisters now secure and their feelings for each other clear, a long engagement seemed unnecessary. They settled on the first Saturday in August, giving them just over a month to prepare. News of their engagement spread quickly through the territory. Most responses were positive. The ranch hands offered hearty congratulations. Mrs. Wilkins wept happy tears, and even Mrs. Sullivan from the Ladies' Aid Society sent a politely worded note of good wishes. But there were also raised eyebrows and whispers about the unusual circumstances of their meeting. "Let them talk," York said, whenever Josephine worried about the gossip. What matters is what we know to be true. The weeks leading up to the wedding passed in a flurry of preparations. Mrs. Bennet was commissioned to make a wedding dress for Josephine and new dresses for her sisters. The house was cleaned from top to bottom, the garden tended with special care to ensure plenty of flowers for the celebration, and York arranged for a proper honeymoon a week in Helena, staying at the finest hotel. 2 days before the wedding, as Josephine was helping Mrs. Wilkins prepare food for the reception, a familiar carriage pulled up in front of the house. Through the kitchen window, she saw Rebecca Aldridge step down, as elegantly attired as before. "I'll see to her," Josephine said, wiping her hands on her apron. "Please tell York we have a visitor." She met Rebecca on the porch, determined to be gracious despite the unease the woman's presence stirred in her. "Miss Aldridge," she greeted with a polite smile. "What a surprise! York is out with the cattle, but he should return shortly. Would you care to wait inside?" Rebecca studied her with those cool green eyes. "Miss Hayes, or should I say the future Mrs. Xerxes, news travels fast even to Denver. Please call me Josephine," she offered, refusing to be intimidated. After a moment's hesitation, Rebecca nodded. "And I'm Rebecca, of course." She glanced toward the door. "I won't come in, thank you. I'd prefer to speak with you privately first." Curious and somewhat apprehensive, Josephine gestured to the porch chairs. "Then let's sit here. It's a pleasant day." Once seated, Rebecca wasted no time on pleasantries. "I'll be direct, Josephine. Are you marrying York for love or for his property?" The blunt question stung, but Josephine kept her composure. "For love, of course. The ranch is magnificent, but it's York who makes it home." Rebecca studied her face, searching for any sign of deception. Finally, she seemed satisfied. "Good. He deserves someone who truly cares for him. I thought I did once. Perhaps I did in the limited way a sheltered girl understands love." "Why are you here, Rebecca?" Josephine asked gently. The elegant woman sighed. "To make amends, I suppose. And to be sure that York is truly happy." She looked out across the ranch, her expression softening. "He blamed himself for my brother's death, you know, carried that guilt for years. My father's condemnation only reinforced it. It wasn't his fault," Josephine said firmly. "Disease comes to everyone, rich or poor. I know that now." Rebecca turned back to her. "I tried to tell him so when I visited, but he wouldn't listen, not to me." A small, sad smile curved her lips. "But he seems to listen to you." "Sometimes," Josephine admitted, returning the smile. "He's still stubborn about many things." Rebecca laughed softly. "That hasn't changed then." Her expression grew serious again. "I want you to know that I wish you both well, truly. My offer to York wasn't made out of love, at least, not the kind that sustains a marriage. It was made from guilt and a desire to mend the past." "Thank you for your honesty," Josephine said, touched by the woman's candor. "He looks at you differently than he ever looked at me," Rebecca observed. "There's a piece in him now that was missing before." Before Josephine could respond, the sound of approaching hoofbeats announced York's return. He rode into the yard, dismounting quickly when he spotted Rebecca on the porch with Josephine. "Rebecca," he greeted, his tone questioning as he climbed the steps. "This is unexpected." "I came to congratulate you," she explained, rising to her feet, "and to meet your bride properly." She glanced at Josephine with a genuine smile. "She's quite remarkable, York. I approve wholeheartedly." York looked between the two women, clearly surprised by the apparently friendly conversation. "Thank you," he said cautiously. "That's kind of you, not kind, honest." Rebecca picked up her reticule. "I won't intrude on your preparations. I'm returning to Denver tomorrow, but I wanted to wish you both happiness." She extended her hand to Josephine. "Take care of him. He's better than he believes himself to be." Josephine took the offered hand, feeling a surprising connection with this woman who had once held York's heart. "I know, and I will." Rebecca nodded, seemingly satisfied. After a brief, formal farewell to York, she returned to her carriage and departed, leaving them standing together on the porch. "What was that about?" York asked, still looking bewildered. Josephine smiled, taking his hand. "I believe it was about closure, for all of us." The day of the wedding dawned clear and perfect, a brilliant Montana August morning with a sky so blue it hurt to look at it. The ceremony was to be held at the ranch, with Reverend Collins coming from town to officiate. Chairs had been set up in the garden, which was now in full bloom thanks to Josephine's careful tending, and tables laden with food waited under shade trees for the celebration afterward. In the bedroom that would soon no longer be hers alone, Josephine stood before the mirror as Jane fastened the last buttons on her wedding gown. It was simpler than the fashionable dresses Rebecca wore, but more beautiful to Josephine's eyes, ivory silk with delicate lace at the collar and cuffs, the skirt falling in soft folds to the floor. "You look like Mama," Jane said softly, adjusting the small wreath of wildflowers that crowned Josephine's upswept hair. She would be so proud today. Tears threatened, but Josephine blinked them away. "I wish they could be here, both of them." "They are, in a way," Jane assured her, pressing something into her hand. "This was Mama's. I found it among her things after they died. I've been saving it for today." Josephine looked down to find a small cameo brooch in her palm, a family heirloom that had once belonged to their grandmother. "Oh, Jane," she whispered, deeply touched. "It's perfect." After pinning the brooch to her bodice, Josephine embraced her sister tightly. "Thank you for everything. For being so strong through all of this." Jane returned the hug. "I learned from the best." A knock at the door announced Julia and Jennifer, both resplendent in new dresses of pale blue that complemented their chestnut hair. Jennifer carried a small bouquet of wildflowers and roses from the garden. "Joey, you look like a princess," she exclaimed, her eyes wide with wonder. "The most beautiful bride ever," Julia agreed, her voice catching with emotion. Another knock, firmer this time, revealed Mrs. Wilkins. "It's time, dears," she announced, her own eyes suspiciously bright. "Everyone's waiting, and that poor man looks ready to wear a path in the ground with his pacing." Josephine took a deep breath, smoothing her hands over her skirts. "I'm ready." The small procession made its way downstairs and out to the garden, where guests had gathered, neighbors from surrounding ranches, townsfolk including Doc Miller and Sheriff Davis, and of course the ranch hands, all scrubbed and uncomfortable in their Sunday best. At the end of the makeshift aisle, beneath an arch of roses, stood York. He had traded his usual work clothes for a formal black suit that emphasized his height and the breadth of his shoulders. His dark hair was neatly combed, and his face clean-shaven for the occasion. But it was his expression, as he caught sight of Josephine, that took her breath away. The naked adoration and wonder in his eyes made her feel truly beautiful, truly worthy of the love this good man offered. With Jane on one side and Julia on the other, Jennifer leading the way with her flowers, Josephine walked toward her future. Each step felt both momentous and perfectly natural, as if she had been moving toward this moment her entire life. When she reached York's side, he took her hands in his fingers warm and strong around hers. "You are more beautiful than I deserve," he whispered, for her ears alone. "We deserve each other," she corrected gently. Reverend Collins began the ceremony, his voice carrying clearly in the perfect summer air. The traditional words took on new meaning as Josephine repeated them, promising to love, honor, and cherish this man who had saved her in every way a person could be saved. When York spoke his vows, His voice was steady but filled with emotion that reached everyone present. "I, York Xerxes, take thee, Josephine Hayes, to be my wedded wife. To have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death do us part." The exchange of rings, a simple gold band for Josephine, which York had purchased in Helena, and his father's ring for York, which he had kept safe all these years, sealed their promises. "By the power vested in me," Reverend Collins concluded, "I now pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss your bride." York cupped Josephine's face gently in his hands and kissed her with reverent tenderness that gradually deepened into something more passionate as the guests erupted in cheers and applause. When they finally parted, both slightly breathless, Jennifer darted forward to hug them both around the waist. "We all came home," she declared happily. "Just like York promised." York laughed, lifting the child into his arms. "That's right, little one, we all came home." The celebration lasted well into the evening, with music provided by Walter and Thomas on fiddle and harmonica, dancing on a wooden platform York had constructed for the occasion, and enough food and drink to satisfy even the hungriest ranch hands. As twilight settled over the land and lanterns were lit around the garden, York led Josephine away from the festivities to a quiet corner of the porch. "Happy, Mrs. Xerxes?" he asked, his arms encircling her waist. "Happier than I ever thought possible," she answered truthfully, leaning into his embrace. "And you, complete," he said simply. "For the first time in my life I feel complete." Josephine rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "It's strange, isn't it? How close we came to never meeting. If my parents hadn't died, if yours had lived, if 100 other things had happened differently." "But they didn't," York reminded her, "and here we are." He tilted her face up to his. "I don't believe in much that can't be seen or touched, Josephine. But I believe some people are meant to find each other, no matter what paths they travel to get there." "Even if one of those paths leads through a saloon auction?" she asked, the old shame momentarily resurfacing. "Especially then," York insisted, kissing her forehead tenderly. "Because that act of desperate courage brought you to me, and I will spend the rest of my life making sure you never need to be that desperate again." As they rejoined the celebration, accepting congratulations and well wishes from their guests, Josephine looked around at the ranch that had become her home, at her sisters laughing and dancing without the weight of worry that had burdened them for so long, and at the man who had made it all possible. From the darkest moment of her life had come this unexpected joy. Whatever challenges the future might hold, she would face them with York beside her, with the strength of their love and the foundation of the home they had built together. They had all come home, just as York had promised on that fateful day. And home, Josephine now knew, was not merely a place, but the people who filled it with love. Epilogue: 5 years later, the autumn sunrise painted the eastern sky in shades of gold and crimson, as Josephine stood on the porch, cradling a cup of coffee in her hands. Behind her, the ranch house was still quiet, its occupants enjoying the last moments of sleep before another busy day began. 5 years had brought many changes to the Xerxes ranch. The house had been expanded to accommodate their growing family, a nursery added off the main bedroom, the kitchen enlarged, a proper schoolroom built for the children. The cattle herd had nearly doubled in size, and York had added sheep to their operation, a venture that had proven surprisingly profitable. But the greatest changes were in the people themselves. Jane, now 22, had completed her education in Helena and returned to Wytrock as the town's new schoolteacher, boarding with the minister and his wife during the week and returning to the ranch on weekends. Julia, at 19, had discovered a talent for business and helped York manage the ranch accounts, while developing a courtship with Thomas, now the ranch foreman. Jennifer, 14 and as spirited as ever, was the best rider on the ranch besides York himself, and had already announced her intention to compete in the territorial rodeo when she turned 16. And then there were the newest additions to the family. Josephine smiled as she heard the patter of small feet behind her, followed by a sleepy voice. "Mama, is it morning already?" She turned to find her 4-year-old son, William, rubbing his eyes with one hand while clutching his favorite wooden horse in the other. With his father's dark hair and her green eyes, he was a perfect blend of them both. "Yes, my love," she answered, setting her coffee aside to lift him into her arms. "The sun is just waking up." William rested his head on her shoulder, still half asleep. "Is Papa home yet?" "Not yet. But he promised to be back today, remember." York had been in Helena for the past week, negotiating a contract to supply beef to the railroad camps. The sound of an infant's cry drifted through the open window of the nursery. Josephine kissed William's forehead and set him down. "That's your sister. Should we go see her?" Hand in hand, they returned inside to the nursery where 3-month-old Elizabeth was making her presence known. The baby quieted as soon as Josephine lifted her from the cradle, her tiny face relaxing into a contented expression. "She always knows when it's you," came a deep voice from the doorway. Josephine turned, her heart leaping at the sight of York leaning against the doorframe, trail dust still clinging to his clothes but his eyes warm with love. "Papa!" William cried, launching himself across the room to be swept up into his father's arms. "There's my boy," York said, hugging him close before moving to Josephine's side. He kissed her tenderly, then gazed down at their daughter. "And my beautiful girls, I've missed you all." "We've missed you too," Josephine assured him. "Did the negotiations go well?" York nodded. "Better than expected. We secured the contract at a fair price with an option to renew next year." He stroked Elizabeth's downy head with one gentle finger. "But that's not all I accomplished in Helena." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a folded document, which he handed to Josephine. Shifting the baby to one arm, she opened it and scanned the contents, her eyes widening in surprise. "York, this is the deed to the Hayes cabin and surrounding land," he confirmed. "I've been trying to purchase it for years, but the bank was reluctant to sell. Finally convinced them." Tears filled Josephine's eyes as she understood the significance of his gesture. "You bought our old home." "I thought we might fix it up," York explained, wrapping his free arm around her waist. "Not to live in, but to preserve. So our children will always know where their mother's strength and courage began. So they'll understand that sometimes the darkest days lead to the brightest futures." Josephine leaned into his embrace, overwhelmed by his thoughtfulness. "I love you," she whispered. "More each day." "And I you," York replied, kissing her forehead. "My brave, beautiful Josephine." Later that day, as the family gathered for dinner Jane home for the weekend, Julia and Thomas sharing shy glances across the table, Jennifer regaling everyone with tales of her latest riding adventures, William seated on a stack of books to reach his plate, Elizabeth sleeping peacefully in a cradle nearby, Josephine looked around at the life she and York had built together. From the desperate young woman willing to auction herself to feed her sisters, to the mistress of a prosperous ranch and mother of 2 beautiful children, her journey had been remarkable. But more remarkable still was the love that had made it all possible. York's initial act of compassion that had transformed into a deep and abiding love, strong enough to weather any storm. "What are you thinking about?" York asked quietly, noticing her reflective expression. Josephine smiled, covering his hand with hers on the table. "About promises kept," she answered, and how we all came home just as you said we would." York turned his hand to clasp hers, his eyes reflecting all the love in his heart. "And home we'll stay," he promised. "Together always." In the warmth of their family circle, with the ranch spreading out around them and the future bright with promise, Josephine knew that no auction block or gilded Denver mansion could ever match the riches she had found here in this home, with this man, surrounded by the love that had saved them all.